Human beings like to believe they are controlled by logic, but most humans are controlled by desire, not because they are evil, because they are human. The human brain was designed for survival, for pleasure, for repetition, and modern society learned how to exploit every weakness inside that system. Endless stimulation, infinite novelty, validation, fantasy, escape. The result? A human system that slowly loses control over itself. And the terrifying part is, most people never realize it is happening because the system does not collapse instantly. It collapses gradually, one stimulus at a time. This is where the real battle begins. Inside the human brain, two systems constantly compete for control. The logical system, responsible for awareness, discipline, planning, long-term thinking, and self-control. And the primitive reward system, driven by dopamine, impulse, pleasure, novelty, and craving. The problem is not desire itself. Desire is natural. Without desire, humans would not survive, reproduce, build families, or pursue meaning. But modern hyperstimulation overloads ancient biology. The brain evolved for limited rewards, not infinite stimulation, not endless scrolling, not constant novelty, not dopamine flooding every second. And once the reward system becomes overclocked, impulse grows stronger than awareness. The human no longer chooses consciously. He reacts automatically. Trigger, craving, action, relief, regret, repeat. Over time, the brain begins rewiring itself around stimulation, and eventually, the human stops chasing meaning and starts chasing relief. Desire did not begin in modern society. Desire is ancient, long before cities, phones, social media, or pornography. The human brain was already wired for survival, to search for food, to avoid danger, to reproduce, to bond, to explore, to adapt. These systems helped humanity survive for thousands of years. Dopamine was never meant to destroy humans. It was meant to guide behavior toward survival. But the modern world discovered something dangerous. If you artificially stimulate the reward system hard enough, the brain begins craving intensity instead of meaning. Ancient biology meets infinite stimulation, and now the same system once used for survival is being hijacked by endless novelty. Social media, validation, pornography, junk food, gaming, impulse consumption. The reward system becomes overloaded. The logical brain weakens, and the human slowly becomes reactive instead of conscious. This is not weakness. This is biology being exploited beyond its original design. Most people misunderstand desire. They think desire itself is evil, but desire is the engine of life. Without desire, humans would never eat, learn, love, build, protect, create, or evolve. Desire exists on multiple levels. Biological desire drives survival of the body, hunger, thirst, sexual attraction, rest, protection. Psychological desire drives survival of identity, validation, achievement, status, recognition, control. And spiritual desire drives something even deeper: meaning, truth, connection, purpose, transcendence. The problem is not desire, the problem is unconscious desire, because every desire creates a cycle: trigger, anticipation, craving, pursuit, reward, crash, repeat. And if awareness is absent, the loop controls the human. But if awareness becomes stronger than impulse, desire transforms into direction. Then the human no longer becomes enslaved by the system. He begins mastering it. Desire is not your enemy. Blindness is. Lust is not magic, it is biology, a survival mechanism embedded deep inside the human nervous system. The human brain evolved to prioritize reproduction, because reproduction ensured survival of the species. That is why visual stimulation can trigger such powerful reactions. The eyes detect a stimulus, the brain evaluates it emotionally, the reward system activates, dopamine rises, attention narrows, the primitive brain begins overriding higher reasoning. This is why attraction can feel automatic, because instinct reacts faster than conscious thought. Hormones like testosterone amplify drive, risk-taking, motivation, competition, and pursuit behavior. Again, none of this is evil. This is ancient biology doing exactly what it was designed to do. But the danger begins when modern stimulation exceeds biological limits. The brain was never designed for infinite novelty, never designed for endless scrolling, constant exposure, artificial stimulation, hypersexual content, instant access to pleasure. Now the reward circuitry becomes overloaded, and slowly the brain begins craving stimulation instead of connection, pleasure instead of meaning, impulse instead of awareness. The system starts reinforcing itself. Trigger, dopamine, pleasure, memory, craving, repetition, until eventually the human no longer controls the desire controls the human. Human biology has not changed much in thousands of years, but the environment has changed completely. Ancient humans lived in survival conditions, limited food, limited stimulation, clear purpose, natural dopamine cycles. The brain received small rewards connected to effort, survival, bonding, and reproduction. But modern systems discovered how to artificially hijack attention. Now the human nervous system faces something ancient biology never evolved for: unlimited stimulation, endless novelty, infinite scrolling, artificial rewards, instant gratification. Every notification, every image, every algorithm, every dopamine spike pulls directly on ancient reward circuitry. The result is psychological overload. The reward system becomes desensitized. The brain needs stronger stimulation to feel the same reward. Attention weakens, impulse increases, emotional stability declines. The modern human is not simply distracted, he is neurologically overwhelmed. Ancient brain, modern overload, and most people never realize their environment is training their nervous system every single day. Puberty is one of the most confusing transitions in human life, because the body changes before the mind fully understands what is happening. Hormones begin rising, testosterone increases, dopamine sensitivity intensifies. The reward system starts reorganizing itself, emotions become stronger, curiosity increases, attention shifts toward attraction, identity, status, and connection. And suddenly, a young human begins feeling things never felt before. Not because he is evil, not because he is corrupted, because biology has awakened survival and reproductive systems. The brain during adolescence is still under construction. The emotional and instinctive systems develop faster than the systems responsible for long-term control and reasoning. That gap creates confusion. The body reacts automatically, but the mind still lacks understanding. This is why many young humans feel overwhelmed, conflicted, curious, or emotionally unstable during puberty. The body awakens first, the understanding comes later, and if guidance is absent during this stage, confusion becomes conditioning. Attraction is not moral failure, it is biology. The human brain naturally notices signs connected to health, fertility, movement, symmetry, and reproduction. The visual system detects features. The emotional system marks them as important. The reward circuitry activates, dopamine rises, attention locks in. This process happens automatically, especially during adolescence, when hormones are elevated and the reward system becomes hypersensitive. That is why attraction can feel intense. Not because the young human consciously chose corruption, but because ancient survival systems are active before full emotional maturity develops. The real problem begins when instinct develops without awareness. Without guidance, the young mind starts learning from algorithms, hypersexual media, dopamine-driven platforms, and artificial stimulation. Then attraction slowly transforms into obsession. Humans stop being seen as people and start being seen as stimulation. That is where distortion begins, not in attraction itself, but in unconscious attachment to impulse. The goal is not fear, the goal is understanding, because self-control is not suppression. Self-control is awareness directing instinct instead of being enslaved by it. Every human begins innocent, curious, open, emotionally impressionable. But adolescence is a dangerous stage when awareness is absent. Because instinct develops faster than wisdom, the brain becomes highly sensitive to novelty, reward, emotion, and stimulation. And if nobody explains what is happening internally, the young human starts interpreting instinct blindly. Confusion begins, not because the human is broken, because the body is activating systems the mind still cannot fully understand. Now imagine this same developing brain exposed to unlimited stimulation. Algorithms, sexualized media, validation systems, endless scrolling, artificial dopamine spikes. The internet becomes the teacher, and stimulation becomes education. The young brain slowly learns to associate pleasure with escape, attention, fantasy, and emotional relief, not with responsibility, not with meaning, not with truth. This is where conditioning begins. The nervous system adapts to overstimulation. Attention weakens, impulse strengthens, and slowly, desire becomes louder than awareness. The tragedy is this: most young humans were never taught how to understand their own minds, so they become controlled by systems designed to exploit instinct before maturity develops. The human brain is built to learn through repetition. Every repeated experience strengthens neural pathways. This is how habits are formed. At first, a stimulus creates curiosity. Then dopamine rewards the behavior. The brain remembers the relief, the pleasure, the escape, or the emotional distraction. And slowly, repetition turns stimulation into conditioning. The nervous system starts associating certain triggers with reward: images, screens, fantasy, validation, attention. Over time, the brain no longer reacts naturally. It adapts. Natural rewards become weaker. Artificial stimulation becomes stronger. The human begins needing more intensity, more novelty, more stimulation, just to feel the same emotional effect. This is desensitization, and eventually, real human connection starts losing emotional impact. The mind becomes attached, not to people, but to stimulation itself. This is how addiction silently forms, not overnight, but through repeated reinforcement of the same neural loop. Stimulus, dopamine, pleasure, memory, repeat, again, and again, and again, until the behavior stops feeling like a choice. Most people define good and bad emotionally, but emotions change constantly. Truth is deeper than emotion. Good is not simply what feels pleasant, and bad is not simply what feels painful. Good is that which aligns the human system toward clarity, balance, responsibility, truth, discipline, connection, and long-term flourishing. Bad is that which distorts the human system toward addiction, compulsion, self-destruction, objectification, emptiness, and unconscious living. That is the real difference. Good builds, bad corrodes, good strengthens awareness, bad weakens control. Good creates freedom through discipline, bad creates slavery through impulse. When humans align themselves with truth, they build stronger relationships, families, purpose, trust, and inner peace. But when stimulation becomes the center of life, the system slowly collapses. Connection becomes consumption, love becomes validation, humans become objects, and pleasure replaces meaning. The danger is not desire itself. The danger is unconscious desire controlling the mind, because desire guided by awareness creates growth, but desire guided only by impulse creates distortion. Pleasure is not evil. The human brain was designed to experience reward. Pleasure exists for survival, connection, motivation, learning, bonding, and reproduction. Without pleasure, humans would lose the drive to live, create, love, build, or evolve. The problem is not pleasure itself. The problem begins when pleasure becomes the master instead of the servant. When awareness guides pleasure, the human remains balanced. But when impulse controls the system, the mind becomes fragmented. Discipline weakens, focus collapses, purpose disappears, and the brain begins chasing stimulation instead of meaning. This is why modern addiction feels endless, because the mind is no longer searching for fulfillment. It is searching for escape, temporary relief, another dopamine spike, another distraction, another moment of numbness, and eventually the human loses control over his own attention. Pleasure without awareness becomes slavery, but pleasure aligned with truth becomes balance. The goal is not suppression, the goal is mastery, not killing desire, understanding it, not fearing pleasure, preventing it from controlling the mind. When humans stop seeing each other as human beings, society begins collapsing silently. Objectification changes perception itself. A person is no longer seen as a soul, a mind, or a human life. They become stimulation, consumption, validation, fantasy, entertainment. And once this happens, real connection weakens, trust weakens, love weakens, families weaken. The modern world constantly trains the brain to consume people visually. Advertisements, algorithms, social media, endless stimulation. The human nervous system becomes overloaded by artificial attraction. Even children now grow up surrounded by systems designed to capture attention before awareness fully develops. And slowly, humans become emotionally disconnected from reality. Relationships become transactional. Attention becomes currency. Validation replaces meaning, and loneliness grows even in crowded cities. Because humans were never built only for stimulation, they were built for connection, purpose, trust, love, responsibility, and emotional grounding. Objectification destroys that foundation, not because attraction is evil, but because unconscious desire slowly removes empathy from perception, and when empathy disappears, humans stop protecting each other. They start consuming each other. Civilizations do not collapse only through war. Sometimes they collapse slowly, through disconnection. When pleasure replaces meaning, humans stop building deep relationships. Families weaken, trust weakens, loneliness increases, children grow up emotionally disconnected, and society slowly loses its emotional foundation. The modern world offers stimulation 24 hours a day, endless entertainment, endless distraction, endless escape. But the human nervous system was never designed for constant, artificial reward. The result is visible everywhere, people surrounded by millions, yet emotionally isolated. Humans connected digitally, but disconnected psychologically. Pleasure without responsibility creates instability, because pleasure alone cannot sustain a civilization. Only truth, trust, discipline, love, purpose, and long-term commitment can do that. When connection disappears, people begin living only for temporary relief, and eventually, future generations inherit emotional emptiness instead of wisdom. This is why awareness matters, because societies survive when humans learn to control desire instead of becoming controlled by it. Most addiction is not driven by pleasure. It is driven by emptiness. The human keeps chasing something, hoping the next reward will finally remove the pain. More validation, more attention, more stimulation, more escape, more distraction. But the relief never lasts. Because the real problem was never outside. It was inside, an emotional void, a lack of meaning, a lack of grounding, a lack of connection with truth. Modern systems understand this weakness extremely well. They sell temporary emotional relief to lonely humans, and for a moment, the brain feels comfort, a dopamine spike, a distraction, a sense of being wanted. But once the stimulation fades, the emptiness returns stronger than before. So the cycle repeats again. Humans become chained to temporary relief, not because they are evil, but because pain without awareness seeks escape automatically. This is why unconscious desire becomes dangerous, because eventually the human no longer controls the craving. The craving controls the human, and the more the mind escapes reality, the more disconnected it becomes from peace. Real peace does not come from endless stimulation. It comes from alignment, truth, purpose, connection, discipline, and learning how to sit with yourself without needing constant escape. The human brain is one of the most complex systems in existence. Ancient instincts, biological drives, emotional reactions, social conditioning, genetics, curiosity, fear, desire, attachment. All of it begins activating long before a young human fully understands what is happening inside himself. Puberty changes the system rapidly. Hormones increase, dopamine sensitivity rises, attention changes, attraction emerges, emotions intensify. And suddenly, the mind enters a reality it was never prepared to navigate. Without guidance, confusion is born. Not because the human is evil, but because instinct develops before wisdom. The body reacts before the mind understands, and if no one explains the mechanism, the young mind begins learning from the environment instead, from algorithms, from overstimulation, from entertainment, from distorted social systems. The internet becomes the teacher, and repetition slowly becomes conditioning. This is why awareness matters, because confusion alone is not dangerous. Unconscious confusion is. A human who understands his own system can develop discipline, but a human who never learns what controls him becomes controlled by it. Addiction rarely begins as addiction. It usually begins as relief, a moment of escape, a moment of stimulation, a moment where the brain temporarily feels better. But the nervous system remembers reward very quickly, especially during adolescence. When dopamine sensitivity is extremely high, a trigger appears. The brain anticipates relief, the urge activates, the action follows, dopamine spikes, and for a moment, the pain disappears. But after the spike comes the crash. Emptiness returns, stress returns, loneliness returns, and the brain remembers the fastest escape route, so the cycle repeats, again and again and again, until the urge becomes automatic. This is the addiction loop. The more repetition occurs, the stronger the neural pathway becomes, and eventually the human stops choosing consciously. The conditioning begins choosing for him. Isolation increases, shame increases, discipline weakens, focus weakens, relationships weaken, potential weakens, and many people remain trapped because they mistake temporary relief for healing. But escape is not healing. Numbing is not freedom. Freedom begins when awareness interrupts the loop, when the human stops obeying every impulse automatically and starts rebuilding control over attention, behavior, and meaning. The loop is powerful, but the human mind is capable of rewiring itself. Awareness can break conditioning, discipline can weaken impulses, and purpose can replace addiction. Every human eventually reaches a crossroads. One path offers immediate pleasure, easy escape, easy stimulation, easy comfort, no resistance, no discipline, no sacrifice. It feels easier in the beginning. But the path of least resistance slowly becomes the path of dependence, because a mind trained to obey every impulse loses the ability to command itself. Comfort becomes weakness, pleasure becomes slavery, and temporary escape becomes long-term regret. The human slowly loses clarity, focus, purpose, and inner freedom, not instantly, gradually, one repeated choice at a time. But there is another path, harder at first, the path of discipline, the path where the human learns to control impulses instead of serving them, the path of sacrifice, truth, self-awareness, responsibility, faith, and purpose. This path demands resistance, because growth always demands resistance. Muscles grow through resistance, character grows through resistance, discipline grows through resistance, and the mind becomes stronger every time it refuses unconscious impulses. Most people want freedom, but freedom without self-control is impossible. A human enslaved by urges is not truly free. Real freedom begins when the mind becomes stronger than temporary pleasure. And although discipline feels painful in the beginning, it creates peace in the end. While uncontrolled pleasure feels good in the beginning, but often creates suffering in the end. Every repeated decision builds a direction, and eventually, direction becomes destiny. Human beings were not designed for endless stimulation. They were designed for connection, real connection, family, friendship, purpose, belonging, meaning. But modern systems increasingly replace connection with consumption. People are surrounded by screens, algorithms, noise, and artificial interaction. Yet many feel more alone than ever before, because stimulation is not the same as connection. Attention is not love, validation is not belonging, and distraction is not healing. A human can be constantly entertained while emotionally empty inside. Loneliness grows when the soul stops experiencing genuine human connection. When conversations disappear, when families disconnect, when trust weakens, when people become emotionally isolated inside digital worlds, and many attempt to escape loneliness through more stimulation, more scrolling, more entertainment, more addiction, more distraction. But excessive stimulation often numbs the very systems responsible for emotional bonding. The result is a cycle. Loneliness creates escape. Escape weakens connection, and weakened connection creates deeper loneliness. This is why meaning matters. This is why family matters. This is why purpose matters. A human being cannot survive psychologically on pleasure alone. The nervous system may chase stimulation, but the soul still searches for connection. And without connection, loneliness grows. Civilization is not built by isolated individuals. It is built through generations. Every society, every nation, every culture, and every civilization begins with family. because family is the foundation through which values, discipline, identity, protection, and purpose are transferred across generations. Human populations do not grow through pleasure alone, they grow through stability, commitment, responsibility, long-term sacrifice, and strong family structures. Across history, religions and civilizations understood this deeply. Different cultures used different words, but many recognized the same truth, that human beings were not designed to live completely alone, because isolation weakens societies, while stable families strengthen them. When family structures collapse, civilizations often experience rising loneliness, declining birth rates, emotional instability, and weakening social trust. A society focused only on individual pleasure eventually begins to lose long-term continuity, because civilizations survive when generations choose responsibility over temporary gratification. Children inherit more than genetics. They inherit emotional patterns, values, discipline, belief systems, and identity. This is why family matters beyond the individual. Strong families create stable communities. Stable communities create stronger civilizations. And civilizations that lose connection, purpose, and responsibility eventually begin to decay from within. Human beings search for connection because connection is part of human design, not weakness, not dependency, but structure. A civilization survives when humans stop living only for themselves and begin building for future generations across civilizations, cultures, and religions. Human beings repeatedly arrived at a similar conclusion: that man alone is incomplete, not biologically alone, psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually alone. Human beings were designed for companionship, for emotional connection, for mutual support, for family, for belonging. Different traditions describe this in different ways. Some described woman as the better half. Some described companionship as tranquility. Others described a partner as a helper or companion. Different languages, different cultures, but often pointing toward the same human reality, that isolation slowly weakens the human being, because companionship is not merely physical. It regulates emotion, creates stability, strengthens purpose, reduces loneliness, and anchors the human mind against chaos. Modern culture often glorifies radical independence, but complete isolation frequently creates emotional fragmentation. Humans begin searching for artificial substitutes, endless entertainment, addiction, validation, escapism, temporary pleasure, because the nervous system still seeks connection, the soul still seeks meaning, and the human mind still seeks belonging. This does not mean every relationship is healthy, nor does it mean a human becomes worthless alone, but it means genuine companionship fulfills something deeply embedded within human nature, because humans were not designed merely to consume pleasure. They were designed to build bonds, to create families, to protect one another, to grow together, and to carry meaning across generations. The stronger the connection, the stronger the human system becomes. Across history, human beings searched for the meaning of companionship, not only emotionally, but spiritually, because many traditions recognized something profound: that human beings are incomplete in isolation. In the book of Genesis, it is written, "It is not good for man to be alone." Not because man is weak, but because human beings were designed for relationship, cooperation, family, and shared existence. Across civilizations, this idea appears repeatedly. In Hindu thought, the concept of Ardangini describes the wife as the better half, not property, not possession, but completion. In Islamic understanding, the concept of sakina describes tranquility, peace, affection, and mercy placed between human beings. Not merely desire, not merely attraction, but emotional stillness, a place where the restless human mind finds peace. Different traditions used different languages, but many pointed toward the same truth, that healthy companionship stabilizes the human system. It reduces loneliness, strengthens meaning, builds families, protects generations, and creates continuity across civilization itself. Modern society often reduces relationships to stimulation, appearance, status, or temporary pleasure. But deeper traditions viewed companionship as sacred responsibility, as emotional protection, as growth, as mercy, because the strongest human systems are rarely built in complete isolation. Human beings become stronger when connected through trust, responsibility, love, sacrifice, and shared purpose. Not every relationship succeeds, not every connection is healthy, but the need for genuine human companionship remains deeply rooted within human nature itself, because the human soul was never designed to survive on stimulation alone. It was designed to grow through connection. Across history, many societies divided human worth through power, status, or gender, but deeper spiritual traditions often challenged this idea. Because consciousness itself is not male or female, the human soul is not measured by physical strength, wisdom, discipline, compassion, awareness, and spiritual growth exist within both man and woman. Different civilizations expressed this differently. Some traditions described masculine and feminine energies as complementary forces, not enemies, not competitors, but balancing principles within existence itself. The idea was not sameness in every role, but equal spiritual value, equal human dignity, equal potential for growth, wisdom, sacrifice, and transcendence. When societies reduce human beings to objects, status, or utility, they weaken both men and women, because civilizations become healthier when humans recognize one another beyond impulse and surface identity, not merely through desire, but through consciousness, responsibility, respect, and mutual growth. A healthy society does not require the destruction of masculinity or femininity. It requires balance, because imbalance creates conflict, while balance creates stability. The strongest systems in nature are balanced systems, mind and emotion, strength and mercy, discipline and compassion, masculine and feminine, not domination, not erasure, but harmony. Human beings are powerful alone, but often stronger together. Across psychology, biology, and spiritual tradition, many viewed masculine and feminine traits as complementary forces, different strengths, different tendencies, different roles at times, but capable of creating balance when united properly. Strength without compassion can become harshness. Compassion without strength can become fragility. Discipline without mercy becomes cold. Mercy without discipline becomes unstable. Balance creates wholeness. This is why many ancient traditions used symbolic language to describe human partnership, not as ownership, not as superiority, but as completion, like two parts forming a stable structure, like two sides balancing a system. The goal was never dependency without growth, nor isolation without connection, but mutual strengthening. Healthy companionship helps regulate emotion, reduce loneliness, increase stability, and create long-term meaning. The strongest relationships are not built only on attraction. They are built on trust, responsibility, sacrifice, respect, and shared purpose. Modern culture often trains humans to chase stimulation while avoiding responsibility. But stable unions require responsibility, because lasting peace cannot survive on impulse alone. It survives through character, through patience, through loyalty, through emotional maturity. When two people strengthen one another's minds, protect one another's dignity, and build meaning together, the human system becomes more stable, not perfect, but stronger. Because completion is not about weakness needing rescue. It is about balance creating wholeness. Civilization did not emerge from chaos by accident. Stable societies required structure, rules, discipline, responsibility. Across history, human beings created systems to reduce violence, protect families, distribute resources, and preserve order across generations. Without structure, tribes collapse into conflict. Without law, power dominates weakness. Without responsibility, future generations inherit instability. Many early systems were imperfect, some became corrupt, some became oppressive. But the central purpose behind civilization itself was survival and stability. Humans realized something important. Impulse alone cannot sustain society. Short-term pleasure cannot build long-term civilizations. Because civilizations survive through sacrifice, through cooperation, through protection, through responsibility toward family, children, and community. Stable societies require people willing to delay gratification for a future larger than themselves, to build homes instead of merely consuming, to raise children instead of abandoning responsibility, to create order instead of endless chaos. This is why ancient societies emphasized duty so heavily, because every civilization eventually learns the same lesson. Freedom without responsibility becomes self-destruction. And when responsibility disappears, social trust collapses with it. Healthy systems are not sustained by pleasure alone. They are sustained by disciplined humans, capable of protecting something beyond themselves. Pleasure itself is not the enemy, but uncontrolled craving can become a prison. The human brain adapts to repeated stimulation. What begins as curiosity can become dependence. What begins as escape can become compulsion. Modern systems understand this deeply. Algorithms, advertising, hypersexual media, and endless stimulation compete directly for human attention, not to strengthen people, but to keep them consuming. The result is overstimulation without fulfillment, temporary dopamine spikes followed by emptiness, short-term escape followed by long-term dissatisfaction. The more a person relies on stimulation to escape pain, loneliness, stress, or insecurity, the weaker their internal control can become, because impulse grows stronger when repeatedly rewarded. Over time, discipline weakens, attention fractures, relationships become distorted. Real human connection may begin to feel less stimulating than artificial fantasy, and this creates a dangerous loop. Loneliness increases craving. Craving increases isolation. Isolation deepens suffering. The individual becomes trapped between temporary pleasure and permanent emptiness. A civilization addicted to stimulation eventually loses the ability to sacrifice for the future. Because discipline requires tolerating discomfort, growth requires resistance, and maturity requires mastering impulse rather than obeying it. Freedom is not the ability to chase every desire. Freedom is the ability to remain in control of yourself. For most of history, survival required protection, construction, and sacrifice. Humans built civilizations through labor, risk, and cooperation across generations. Homes had to be defended, food had to be gathered, infrastructure had to be built. Communities had to survive threats from nature, war, scarcity, and collapse. Across many cultures, men were often expected to carry dangerous responsibilities tied to physical protection and external survival. Hunting, building, guarding, fighting, enduring hardship. Not because suffering was glamorous, but because survival demanded it. Civilizations were not built through comfort alone. They were built through people willing to sacrifice comfort for those they loved. A father protecting his family, a worker building infrastructure, a soldier defending a city, a laborer enduring exhaustion to feed children. These roles carried burden as much as power, because responsibility always carries weight, but strength without morality becomes tyranny, and protection without compassion becomes domination. A healthy society requires strength, guided by wisdom and restraint. The goal of strength was never meant to oppress the vulnerable. It was meant to safeguard stability, family, and future generations. Modern culture often mocks responsibility while glorifying endless consumption. But civilizations weaken when sacrifice disappears, because comfort alone cannot sustain a nation. Only disciplined, responsible humans can. Animals primarily survive through instinct, immediate reaction, territory, dominance, fear, biological impulse. Humans also possess instinct. But civilization emerged because humans developed something beyond instinct: self-awareness, moral reasoning, boundaries, long-term thinking, trust. A society cannot function if every impulse is obeyed immediately, because trust requires restraint, family requires loyalty, community requires respect. Civilization depends on people choosing responsibility over raw impulse. Humans create agreements, laws, and boundaries because boundaries protect stability. Without boundaries, trust collapses. Without trust, relationships collapse. And without relationships, society fragments into isolation and conflict. A child holding a parent's hand symbolizes something deeper than biology: protection, guidance, security. Trust passed from one generation to another. This is why healthy societies teach discipline early, not to suppress humanity, but to civilize instinct so cooperation becomes possible, because raw instinct alone creates survival, but wisdom creates civilization. Human cooperation is built on division of responsibility. Every functioning civilization depends on people fulfilling different roles: builders, teachers, protectors, farmers, mothers, fathers, leaders, workers. Communities collapse when responsibility disappears, because no individual can sustain civilization alone. Cooperation requires trust, and trust requires clarity. This is my responsibility, that is yours. Not as oppression, but as coordination. A healthy system functions when people contribute toward a shared future larger than themselves. Ancient societies understood this deeply. Shared duties reduced chaos, clear roles reduced conflict, mutual responsibility strengthened survival. Modern culture often glorifies radical individualism, but isolated individuals rarely build stable civilizations. Strong societies emerge when people sacrifice personal convenience for collective stability. Because civilization itself is cooperative architecture. No city, family, or future survives without people carrying burdens together. Responsibility shared becomes strength multiplied. Every healthy system in nature contains boundaries. Your skin protects your body. Your immune system protects against intrusion. Your organs remain protected because exposure creates vulnerability. Boundaries are not hatred. Boundaries are preservation. Human relationships function the same way. Trust requires limits. Respect requires restraint. Loyalty requires protection of what is personal and sacred. A boundary says not everything is open for public access. Without boundaries, people become vulnerable to exploitation, manipulation, and harm. Modern culture often confuses boundaries with control, but boundaries actually create safety. Healthy friendships require boundaries. Healthy marriages require boundaries. Healthy societies require boundaries. Because unrestricted access destroys trust. And once trust disappears, relationships decay rapidly. The purpose of boundaries is not isolation. The purpose is preservation of integrity. A civilization without boundaries eventually loses identity, stability, and loyalty, because protection is what allows trust to survive. Civilizations survive through generational transmission. Values are not inherited biologically, they are taught. A child learns behavior through observation long before understanding words. A son watches how his father speaks, how he controls anger, how he treats women, how he handles responsibility, how he responds to hardship. Children imitate what society repeatedly normalizes. This is why fathers historically carried enormous responsibility as teachers of discipline and restraint. Not perfection, guidance, and mothers historically shaped emotional development, compassion, security, and nurturing within the family structure.
Healthy children usually emerge where both strength and compassion exist together. Correction without love creates fear. Love without discipline creates weakness. Balance creates maturity. When generational teaching collapses, confusion replaces wisdom. And confused generations become vulnerable to manipulation, addiction, and destructive impulses. Strong civilizations preserve themselves by passing down values intentionally, not accidentally, because every generation either transmits stability forward or transmits chaos. Human beings do not remain neutral without guidance. When truth weakens, other forces rush in to replace it. Addiction, distraction, consumerism, manipulation, endless stimulation. Civilizations decay gradually before collapsing visibly. First, discipline weakens. Then values become mocked. Then confusion spreads. Then people lose clarity about purpose, identity, family, and responsibility. Into that confusion enter systems designed to exploit impulse. Modern industries profit from attention addiction, sexual stimulation, outrage, escapism, artificial validation. The more distracted a population becomes, the easier it becomes to manipulate. Because confused, people seek relief instead of truth. A civilization addicted to stimulation loses long-term thinking. Future generations inherit fractured families, weakened trust, and emotional instability. This is why guidance matters. Not because humans are incapable of intelligence, but because intelligence without moral direction can still self-destruct. Every civilization eventually faces the same choice: discipline or decay, responsibility or collapse, truth or manipulation. And history repeatedly shows societies survive only when enough people choose responsibility over impulse. A civilization becomes stable when relationships produce peace instead of chaos. The strongest families are not built on domination, nor on selfish individualism. They are built on mutual responsibility, protection, mercy, respect, sacrifice. Human beings are incomplete alone in many ways: emotionally, socially, psychologically. Civilization itself emerged through cooperation between men and women building families, raising children, transmitting values, and protecting future generations. A healthy relationship does not weaken people. It stabilizes them. A stable home produces emotionally secure children. Secure children become disciplined adults. Disciplined adults build trustworthy societies, and trustworthy societies create peace. Modern culture often reduces relationships to pleasure, status, or temporary emotion, but lasting civilizations treated relationships as sacred responsibility.
Because families shape the future long before governments do. Every generation inherits either stability or chaos from the homes before them. When respect disappears, peace disappears. When responsibility disappears, future generations suffer. Strong societies are built when people stop asking, "What can I take?" and start asking, "What can I protect?" The human brain evolved for scarcity. Modern technology delivers endless stimulation, infinite novelty, infinite scrolling, infinite validation, infinite sexual imagery. The brain was never designed to process this volume of dopamine-triggering input continuously. Every notification competes for attention. Every algorithm competes for emotional reaction. Every platform profits from keeping the mind engaged as long as possible. Over time, constant stimulation damages focus. Patience weakens. Impulse control decreases. Silence becomes uncomfortable.
Deep thinking becomes difficult. People begin confusing stimulation with fulfillment. But overstimulation rarely creates peace. It usually creates exhaustion. The more fragmented attention becomes, the harder it becomes to build discipline, relationships, clarity, and long-term purpose. A distracted mind becomes easier to manipulate, because addicted attention loses the ability to think independently. Technology itself is not evil, but tools without discipline eventually control the user. A civilization flooded with endless stimulation slowly loses stillness, reflection, and self-control. And without self-control, freedom becomes fragile. Most addictions begin as attempts to escape emotional pain, loneliness, shame, trauma, fear, emptiness, stress, self-hatred. The addictive behavior temporarily numbs discomfort. Pornography, gaming, scrolling, substances, fantasy, validation seeking, overeating, daydreaming. For a moment, pain disappears, but the relief is temporary, and afterward, the original pain usually returns stronger. This creates the cycle: pain, escape, temporary relief, more pain. The addiction is often not the root problem. It is the coping mechanism, a survival strategy that became destructive over time. This is why punishment alone rarely heals addiction.
Because the person is usually fighting internal suffering, not merely external behavior. Healing begins when the root pain is confronted honestly, not hidden, not numbed endlessly. People escape into artificial worlds when reality feels unbearable. The goal is not merely removing addiction. The deeper goal is rebuilding a life where escape no longer feels necessary, because humans rarely abandon destructive pleasure until meaningful purpose becomes stronger than the pain they are avoiding. The modern attention economy is engineered around dopamine. Every swipe, every notification, every short video, every explicit image, every unpredictable reward. The brain learns to chase stimulation automatically, not because the person is evil, but because the nervous system adapts to repeated reward cycles. Dopamine itself is not pleasure. It is anticipation, motivation, craving. The more artificial stimulation floods the brain, the more ordinary life begins to feel dull. Silence becomes uncomfortable. Books feel slow. Real relationships feel harder. Discipline weakens. The mind becomes trapped in constant seeking. Platforms exploit this intentionally. Algorithms study behavior, predict weakness, and maximize engagement. Because attention is profitable. The result is hyperstimulation without fulfillment. The brain becomes overloaded, yet emotionally empty. People consume more content while feeling less alive. The nervous system never fully rests. The mind becomes fragmented, and eventually, many people lose the ability to sit alone with their own thoughts. A person who cannot control attention cannot fully control life, because what controls attention eventually shapes identity. Freedom requires the ability to say no, even when the brain screams more. Addiction is not random. It follows a neurological loop: trigger, craving, fantasy, action, pleasure, regret, emptiness. Repeat. At first, the behavior feels voluntary, but repetition strengthens neural pathways. The brain learns shortcuts. The cycle becomes automatic. Certain emotions, places, thoughts, or memories begin triggering cravings instantly. Stress, loneliness, boredom, pain, Shame. The mind then creates fantasy, an imagined escape. The brain predicts relief before the behavior even happens. This anticipation itself releases dopamine. Eventually, the person is no longer chasing pleasure. They are trying to escape discomfort. That is why addiction often grows stronger during emotional suffering. The behavior temporarily numbs pain, but afterward, the emotional void returns deeper than before, and each repetition weakens self-control further. The cycle accelerates. What once felt like freedom becomes conditioning, a prison built through repetition. Breaking addiction requires interrupting the loop, not once, repeatedly. Awareness weakens automaticity. Discipline rebuilds control. Pain must be faced directly instead of escaped endlessly, because every repetition wires the brain, but repetition can also rewire it. Every addictive cycle changes identity slowly. At first, there is a trigger, a thought, an urge. The brain anticipates reward. Then craving grows. Attention narrows. Logic weakens. The person begins moving toward the behavior almost automatically. When acting out occurs, dopamine floods the system. For a brief moment, there is relief, pleasure, escape, but the high fades quickly. Aftermath begins. Shame, regret, emptiness, self-disgust. The brain crashes below baseline, and because the emotional pain increases, the person becomes more vulnerable to the next trigger. This is how compulsion forms, not through one choice, but through repeated reinforcement. Over time, the brain associates suffering with escape behaviors automatically. The identity begins eroding. Self-respect weakens. The inner voice becomes hostile. Hope decreases. The person feels trapped inside patterns they no longer fully control. That is the true horror of addiction, not pleasure. Loss of agency. The terrifying realization that what once felt like choice now feels mechanical. But neuroplasticity works both ways. The brain can be conditioned into addiction and conditioned out of it. Every interruption weakens the loop. Every act of discipline strengthens a new pathway. Freedom is rebuilt through repetition, the same way slavery was. Uncontrolled desire does not stay isolated. It spreads into every layer of life. At first, the person seeks stimulation for pleasure, but eventually, the nervous system changes. Dopamine becomes dysregulated. The brain loses sensitivity to ordinary rewards. Real life begins feeling emotionally flat. Focus weakens. Motivation declines. Discipline collapses. The person starts chasing stronger stimulation just to feel normal again. This creates emotional instability, mood swings, anxiety, restlessness, irritability, inner chaos. Then shame appears, because deep down, the person knows their actions are betraying their own values. This creates self-disgust, a divided mind. One part wants freedom. Another part continues feeding the cycle. Over time, meaning itself begins disappearing. The future feels empty. Goals lose emotional weight. Relationships become distorted. People become objects for stimulation instead of souls for connection. This is the hidden cost of addiction. Not only damaged behavior, damaged perception. The brain becomes trapped in survival-level craving, and eventually, the person sacrifices long-term peace for short-term escape. Again, and again, and again, until they either confront reality or completely lose themselves inside avoidance. Addiction is not limited to substances or lust. The underlying mechanism is the same across many forms of uncontrolled desire. The mind believes, once I get this, I will finally feel complete. But the satisfaction never lasts. Lust promises intimacy, yet produces emptiness. Greed promises security, yet produces endless fear of loss. Validation addiction promises worth, yet makes identity dependent on others. Power obsession promises control, yet isolates the person emotionally. Social media addiction promises connection, yet destroys attention and presence. Escapism promises relief, yet prevents real living. Every addiction contains the same illusion. Temporary stimulation mistaken for permanent fulfillment. The nervous system adapts quickly. The craving grows stronger. The baseline drops lower. The person needs more stimulation to feel the same effect. That is why uncontrolled desire becomes a prison. Not because desire itself is evil, but because desire without discipline consumes the mind. A person ruled entirely by impulse loses direction. Weak focus, broken relationships, emotional instability, identity, confusion, an unfinished life. Awareness is the first step. But awareness alone is useless without discipline. Freedom requires training the mind to tolerate discomfort without escaping into destructive behavior, because the strongest prison is the one that feels pleasurable while destroying you. Desire itself is not the enemy. Human beings are driven by desire naturally. The question is, what is directing it? Balanced desire aligns with purpose. It strengthens life. Love creates connection. Family creates responsibility. Discipline creates freedom. Ambition creates achievement. Creativity creates meaning. Growth creates evolution. In balanced desire, the person controls impulses instead of being controlled by them. Pleasure exists, but it serves life instead of replacing it. Distorted desire works differently. The mind becomes obsessed with stimulation itself. Lust becomes compulsion. Greed becomes endless hunger. Pleasure becomes escape. Power becomes domination. Attention becomes addiction. Fantasy replaces reality. The person slowly loses alignment with truth. At first, the behavior feels rewarding, but eventually, the nervous system becomes exhausted. Relationships weaken. Meaning disappears. The person consumes more while becoming emptier. That is the paradox of addiction. The more desperately someone seeks fulfillment externally, the more internally hollow they become. Balanced desire builds. Distorted desire consumes. One creates peace. The other creates dependency. One strengthens identity. The other fractures it. The goal is not to destroy desire. The goal is to discipline it, align it with truth, and place it under conscious control instead of impulse. Desire itself is neutral. It is energy, a force moving through the human mind. What matters is not whether desire exists. What matters is where awareness directs it. The same energy can build a meaningful life or destroy it completely. On one path, desire is disciplined. It becomes purpose, focus, growth, creation, connection, legacy. The person learns patience. They sacrifice temporary comfort for long-term meaning. They train the mind instead of obeying every impulse. Over time, their desires become aligned with reality. This creates inner freedom. On the other path, desire is driven entirely by impulse. Instant gratification becomes the highest value. Pleasure replaces purpose. Escape replaces growth. Consumption replaces contribution. The nervous system becomes addicted to stimulation. And eventually, the person becomes trapped by the very impulses they once believed were freedom. That is the danger of unconscious living. The mind slowly drifts toward comfort while the future collapses quietly in the background. Every repeated action shapes identity. Every repeated impulse strengthens a pathway. You become what you consistently practice. The disciplined mind transforms desire into destiny. The impulsive mind transforms desire into self-destruction. And every moment, the choice continues. Self-control is not suppression. It is conscious direction, the ability to pause between impulse and action. Inside the brain, there are competing systems. One system seeks immediate reward, fast, emotional, automatic, driven by dopamine spikes and survival instincts. This system wants comfort now, pleasure now, escape now. The other system is slower, logical, deliberate. It evaluates consequences, plans for the future, protects long-term goals. Self-control is the strengthening of this higher system. Most people lose control because they train impulsivity daily. Every time someone obeys, every craving instantly, the impulsive pathways grow stronger. The brain adapts to repetition. Weak habits become reinforced neural patterns. But the opposite is also true. Discipline rewires the brain. Delayed gratification strengthens executive control. Small repeated actions slowly rebuild identity. Healthy habits create stronger pathways. Over time, focus improves. Emotional regulation improves. Confidence increases. The person stops reacting automatically to every emotion. This is why freedom is not random. It is trained. A weak system creates chaos. A strong system creates stability. You do not rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your systems. And the brain becomes whatever it repeatedly practices. Most destructive behavior is automatic. The cycle begins before conscious thought fully appears. A trigger happens. An emotion rises. A craving forms. Then the behavior repeats. Afterward comes temporary relief. Then regret. Then shame. Then repetition again. This is the impulse loop. The The problem is not only the behavior. The problem is unconsciousness. The person reacts before awareness intervenes. Awareness is the interrupt, the moment where automatic behavior can finally be observed instead of obeyed. You are not the impulse itself. You are the observer of the impulse. That distinction changes everything. When awareness increases, space appears between emotion and action. The person learns to pause, observe, breathe, name the craving. Watch the sensation without immediately feeding it. This weakens automatic conditioning. Every conscious interruption weakens the old pathway. Every disciplined decision strengthens a new one. Eventually, the brain rewires itself around repeated awareness. Triggers lose power. Emotional regulation improves. The nervous system stabilizes. Identity changes. But awareness alone is not enough. Environment matters. Triggers must be removed. Friction must be added to destructive habits. Supportive systems must replace chaotic ones. Because discipline is easier when the environment supports it. Freedom is not built through motivation alone. It is built through repeated conscious interruption of destructive patterns until a new identity becomes natural. For most of life, people are taught to chase stimulation, more pleasure, more entertainment, more distraction, more validation. But eventually, a strange realization appears: no amount of stimulation permanently satisfies the mind. Pleasure fades quickly. The brain adapts. Desire returns. The chase begins again. That is why endless consumption creates exhaustion instead of fulfillment. Because the human mind was not built only for pleasure. It was built for meaning. Meaning survives after emotion fades. Meaning remains when excitement disappears. Meaning gives suffering direction. And in silence, many people finally discover the truth they spent years escaping. The void was never the enemy. The void was revealing what was missing: purpose, truth, alignment, connection, growth. The person realizes they were trying to fill existential emptiness with stimulation. But stimulation cannot replace purpose. You cannot consume your way into inner peace. You cannot escape yourself forever. Eventually, every distraction becomes quiet. And then reality speaks. This is where transformation begins, not when pleasure is maximized, but when illusion collapses. The moment a person stops asking, "How do I feel good right now?" and starts asking, "What kind of life is worth building?" That is the beginning of awakening. Modern life trains the brain toward overstimulation, constant scrolling, constant noise, constant dopamine spikes. The nervous system never fully rests, and over time, the person loses sensitivity to ordinary life. Silence feels uncomfortable. Stillness feels empty. Reality feels too slow. That is the trap. The brain becomes conditioned to endless stimulation while deeper human needs remain starved. Meaning, purpose, connection, discipline, presence. Beyond stimulation, another life exists, a quieter one, a deeper one. At first, it feels unfamiliar because the nervous system has adapted to chaos. But slowly, awareness begins returning. Focus returns. Emotions stabilize. Cravings weaken. The person stops living only for escape and starts building intentionally. They realize self-control is not punishment. It is liberation. Because when the mind is no longer addicted to constant stimulation, attention becomes powerful again. You stop chasing every impulse. You choose consciously. You create instead of consume endlessly. You contribute instead of escaping. This is the real transformation, from seeking pleasure to building meaning, from reacting automatically to living deliberately, from distraction to presence. And eventually, the person no longer asks life to entertain them constantly. They become strong enough to sit in silence without needing escape. True discipline is not emotional suppression. It is integration. The goal is not to destroy desire. The goal is to understand it, guide it, and align it with reality. Many people fail because they fight themselves violently. They try to eliminate emotion completely. But human beings are not machines. Desire is energy. Emotion is information. The problem begins when awareness disappears and impulse takes control. Integration means awareness remains present. You observe emotions without becoming enslaved by them. You recognize cravings without automatically obeying them. You feel discomfort without escaping instantly. This creates inner stability. The mind becomes centered instead of chaotic. The prefrontal cortex strengthens. Long-term thinking overrides short-term impulses. Environment supports growth instead of sabotage. Relationships become deeper because they are based on truth, not stimulation. Purpose replaces confusion. The person no longer lives reactively. They live intentionally. This is the highest form of self-control, not repression. Alignment. A disciplined life is not emotionally dead. It is emotionally ordered. Passion becomes directed. Energy becomes meaningful. Discomfort becomes growth. And the individual becomes internally free because they are no longer divided against themselves. Integrated mind, aligned life. That is real power. A healthy human being is not driven only by impulse. A healthy human being is integrated. Mind, emotion, body, conscience, purpose, working together instead of fighting each other. Discipline gives direction. Truth creates alignment. Empathy preserves humanity. Awareness prevents unconscious living. Emotional stability allows feelings without becoming enslaved by them. Self-control protects long-term purpose from short-term destruction. When these systems operate together, life becomes internally stable. Not perfect, stable. The modern world often glorifies stimulation, but ignores integration. People strengthen pleasure while weakening discipline. They feed impulse while starving awareness. And eventually, the person fragments internally. But real strength is not aggression. Real strength is inner order, the ability to remain conscious under pressure, the ability to feel emotion without collapsing, the ability to desire something, yet still choose wisely. That is maturity. That is power without ego. The balanced human is not numb, not emotionless, not robotic. They simply become aligned. Thoughts, actions, values, purpose, all moving in the same direction. And when alignment appears, peace emerges naturally, because inner war finally ends. In the end, life becomes a confrontation between two paths, impulse or awareness. One path promises immediate relief, escape, pleasure, distraction, comfort, but slowly it consumes identity. The other path is harder. Awareness requires honesty, discipline, responsibility, delayed gratification. But over time, it rebuilds the human being. This is the final realization. No one is coming to save you from your own mind. The choice has always been yours. Every repeated action shapes the nervous system. Every habit builds identity. Every decision strengthens either impulse or awareness. People often believe transformation happens suddenly. It rarely does. Transformation happens through repeated choices, tiny moments, repeated daily, until eventually the brain changes, the behavior changes, the identity changes, and slowly the person becomes someone different, not because reality changed, because they changed. Impulse creates dependence. Awareness creates freedom. Impulse seeks escape. Awareness seeks truth. Impulse abandons the future for temporary relief. Awareness sacrifices temporary comfort to build a meaningful future. This is why the greatest battle is never external. It is internal, and the outcome determines everything: relationships, purpose, peace, character, destiny. You are both the cause and the effect, the prison, and the key. When impulse becomes the master, humanity begins collapsing from the inside. At first, the person believes they are simply seeking pleasure, but slowly, pleasure becomes dependence, then obsession, then identity. The reward system hijacks behavior. Awareness weakens. Conscience becomes quieter. And eventually, the individual starts justifying what once felt wrong. This is how moral collapse begins. Not instantly. Gradually. One compromise at a time. Impulse trains the brain to prioritize immediate gratification over long-term consequence. The person stops thinking clearly. Reality becomes distorted around craving. Empathy weakens. Relationships become transactional. People become objects. Connection becomes consumption. And eventually, the person harms themselves and others while still believing they are searching for relief. That is the tragedy of uncontrolled desire. It promises escape while creating deeper imprisonment. The more it is fed, the stronger it becomes. Because neural pathways strengthen through repetition. What was once optional becomes automatic. Compulsion replaces choice. This is why self-control is not merely a moral idea. It is neurological survival. Without discipline, impulse expands endlessly, and anything uncontrolled eventually becomes destructive. Not because the person is evil, but because unconsciousness multiplied over time. Beware the human being who cannot control himself, because eventually he loses the ability to protect anything: his mind, his future, his relationships, his integrity, his soul. From the beginning of civilization, men competed for territory, for power, for status, for legacy. But beneath nearly every hierarchy, one hidden force existed: selection. The biological pressure to prove worth, to survive, to reproduce, to become valuable. Men built kingdoms to escape insignificance. Men fought wars to dominate rivals. Men chased wealth to increase status. Men trained their bodies to appear powerful. Men sought admiration because deep within the nervous system, validation became associated with survival itself. The fear was never merely poverty. The fear was invisibility, rejection, being biologically unnecessary. So the human male built identities around performance: win, conquer, achieve, accumulate, prove yourself. And when awareness is absent, the entire human life becomes a performance for validation, not only from women, from society, from other men, from the ego itself. The man begins measuring his worth externally: money, followers, luxury, attention, sexual success, dominance. But external validation is infinite. It never truly ends, because the nervous system adapts. What once satisfied becomes normal. Then more is required: more status, more power, more stimulation, more proof. And slowly, the person forgets who he is without applause. This is where unconscious competition begins destroying the human being. Not because ambition is evil, but because identity became dependent on external approval. The man no longer acts from truth. He acts from psychological hunger. And hunger without awareness becomes slavery. At first, the man only wants to feel worthy. But without awareness, worth becomes attached to external symbols: muscles, money, luxury, sexual fantasy, social media attention, dominance, approval. And slowly, the personality fractures into performances, different masks for different audiences. One identity for attraction, another for status, another for validation, another for ego. But beneath all the masks, the real human being becomes exhausted, because no external achievement can permanently heal internal emptiness. The nervous system keeps demanding more stimulation, more recognition, more proof of value. This is the tragedy of unconscious desire. The person stops asking, "What is true?" and starts asking, "How do I appear valuable?" That is the moment identity becomes corrupted. Pornography becomes artificial validation. Luxury becomes symbolic superiority. Fame becomes psychological addiction. Even relationships become transactional, not connection, performance. The man no longer seeks love. He seeks confirmation of worth. And eventually, he loses the ability to sit alone with himself, because silence exposes the truth. Without external validation, he does not know who he is. This is why awareness matters, because a man who cannot define himself internally will spend his entire life begging reality to define him externally. And the world will exploit that weakness forever. The same biological force that creates civilization can also destroy the human being. Desire itself is not evil. Without desire, humanity would never build, never create, never protect, never reproduce, never evolve. Men built families, cities, science, art, architecture, discipline, and civilization itself through the pressure to survive, reproduce, and create legacy. But the same force becomes catastrophic when consciousness disappears, because unconscious desire transforms creation into addiction, connection into possession, ambition into greed, protection into domination, pleasure into obsession. The problem is not women. The problem is unconscious male behavior reacting blindly to biological impulse. Women become symbols inside the male mind: validation, acceptance, reproduction, worth, status. And when a man does not understand his own mind, he becomes controlled by those symbols. Then civilization begins collapsing internally. Wars emerge from dominance obsession. Greed emerges from status hunger. Addiction emerges from endless stimulation. Jealousy emerges from comparison. And the human nervous system becomes trapped in endless craving. The person keeps consuming, yet never feels complete, because the void was never material. It was psychological, spiritual, existential. This is why awareness is the dividing line between man and animal. The animal follows impulse automatically. The conscious human observes impulse, understands it, and chooses wisely. That is the real evolution, not technological evolution, internal evolution. The ability to feel desire without becoming enslaved by it. The ability to appreciate beauty without losing discipline. The ability to pursue love without abandoning truth. That is what transforms biological instinct into human consciousness. At first, the human only seeks pleasure, a distraction, an escape, a small hit of dopamine. But the nervous system was never designed for infinite stimulation. Every repetition strengthens the impulse loop. Pleasure becomes habit. Habit becomes dependency. Dependency becomes identity. And slowly, consciousness begins collapsing. Discipline weakens. Attention fragments. The mind loses stillness. Then the emotions become unstable. Envy emerges. Comparison emerges. Rage emerges. Obsession emerges. Because overstimulation destroys inner balance. The man begins consuming faster than he can understand himself. Pornography, validation, scrolling, fantasy, impulse, endless stimulation. The primitive brain takes control. And when impulse leads, awareness dies. The human no longer chooses consciously. He reacts automatically, like an animal chasing reward. This is the danger of unconscious desire, not merely moral collapse, neurological collapse, spiritual collapse. The person loses the ability to delay gratification, to think clearly, to sit in silence, to resist craving. And eventually, the human being becomes fragmented, a body controlled by impulse, a mind controlled by stimulation, a life controlled by addiction. Until one realization changes everything. Freedom is not found in feeding desire endlessly. Freedom is found in mastering it. The problem was never woman. Woman is not the enemy. Woman is life itself, motherhood, nurturing, creation, emotional intelligence, continuity of humanity, love, family, future generations. The issue was never feminine existence. The issue was unconscious masculine behavior. A man without awareness projects his emptiness outward. He blames women for his obsession, blames attraction for his lack of discipline, blames beauty for his lack of control. But attraction itself is natural, biological, human. The real question is, can the man remain conscious in the presence of desire? Can he respect beauty without becoming enslaved by it? Can he pursue connection without losing purpose? Can he love without abandoning discipline? That is maturity. Because the conscious man does not suppress desire blindly. He integrates it wisely. He transforms impulse into responsibility, lust into love, attraction into understanding, energy into creation. That is how civilizations survive. Strong men with awareness, strong women with wisdom, mutual respect, balanced polarity, conscious families, purpose larger than temporary pleasure. The unconscious man seeks validation. The conscious man seeks alignment. And when awareness enters the relationship between masculine and feminine, conflict transforms into balance. You were never fighting women. You were fighting your own unconscious mind. The real battle was internal. Impulse versus awareness. Pleasure versus meaning. Addiction versus discipline. Escape versus truth. One path leads downward. Overstimulation. Consumerism. Lust without control. Digital addiction. Emotional chaos. Endless craving. The other path leads upward. Discipline, purpose, truth, family, inner peace, legacy. The difference between those paths is not intelligence, not wealth, not status, awareness. Because awareness interrupts automatic behavior. The conscious human observes desire without instantly obeying it. That is true self-control, not suppression. Mastery. The animal reacts automatically. The conscious human chooses deliberately. And every decision shapes identity. Every repeated action rewires the brain. Every impulse obeyed strengthens slavery. Every impulse mastered strengthens freedom. This is why the modern world profits from distraction. Because distracted people are easier to manipulate, easier to addict, easier to control. But the aware mind becomes dangerous to systems built on unconscious consumption, because awareness creates discipline. Discipline creates independence. Independence creates purpose, and purpose destroys addiction. In the end, the greatest victory is not conquering the world. It is conquering yourself, because the man who masters himself cannot be controlled by impulse, fear, lust, or validation. He becomes aligned. And alignment is freedom. As humanity evolved, something extraordinary happened. The same force that built civilization also became capable of destroying it: desire. At its core, desire is not evil. It is survival, attraction, expansion, creation. Without desire, humanity would never build, fight, discover, love, or continue existing. The desire to survive, the desire to reproduce, the desire to matter. Entire civilizations were shaped by it. Kings conquered for legacy. Men fought for status. Empires rose from competition. Wealth, power, muscles, fame, luxury, dominance, social validation, all became symbols used to prove value to society, to other men, to women. Because deep beneath modern behavior, the human nervous system still carries ancient biological programming: the desire to be chosen, to be respected, to not be insignificant. But when desire is not understood consciously, it begins distorting perception itself. The human stops seeking truth and starts seeking emotional satisfaction. Now reality becomes manipulated to protect ego, justify craving, maintain identity, or escape pain. This is how truth becomes corrupted. Lust becomes obsession. Ambition becomes greed. Connection becomes validation addiction. Pleasure becomes dependency. Technology amplifies it. Algorithms exploit it. Society normalizes it. And eventually, the human loses awareness completely. Not because desire exists, but because desire leads without guidance. This is why value education matters. Guidance matters. Right understanding matters. Because a child who is never taught awareness will eventually be conditioned by impulse, media, addiction, comparison, fear, and artificial validation systems. Every human is preconditioned by something: family, culture, trauma, environment, technology, social systems. The question is not, will conditioning happen? The question is, was the conditioning aligned with truth? Because unconscious conditioning creates unconscious humans. And unconscious humans distort reality itself. They confuse pleasure for happiness, attention for love, consumption for success, impulse for freedom, and illusion for truth. But true understanding begins when the human accepts reality naturally, without emotional distortion. When he observes desire without becoming enslaved by it. When awareness becomes stronger than impulse. That is where consciousness begins. But this creates a deeper question. If humans are so deeply influenced by biology, conditioning, emotion, and limited perception, then can humans truly see reality clearly at all? Or are we only seeing fragments of truth through the limits of the human mind? Because perhaps the greatest illusion of humanity is believing it already understands reality. Next, WHYHUMANSCANNOTSEETRUTH.